Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I'm pleased to speak on the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency Charges Bill 2021 and the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency Cost Recovery Bill 2021. Labor cannot support either of these bills. The bills, if passed, would enable the establishment of a new charge levied on higher education service providers aimed at recovering the cost of the regulator, the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency. In doing so, these bills would alter the current arrangements for the agency in which only partial cost recovery is provided for, instead seeking to recover the full cost of the agency's regulatory activities. Unfortunately, Mr Acting Deputy President, the devil in this case is not in the detail, because these bills provide a distinct lack of detail on just how the cost recovery framework proposed will operate. Sadly, this is increasingly becoming standard practice from this government. Provide a shell of a bill, delegating powers to regulations, wait for the bills to pass, and then, and only then, reveal the specific set of rules, fees, or enforcement mechanisms that will operate by regulation. This makes it difficult for the Senate, in particular, to do its important work and raise serious questions about transparency and accountability in this Parliament. And so it goes that once again we are unable to properly consider the specifics of these proposed changes. Nonetheless, Mr Acting Deputy President, the government has not been able to convince stakeholders of the merits of these bills, nor is the opposition satisfied of its necessity. Labor opposes these bills in part because now is absolutely not the time to be levying additional costs and fees on a sector that has suffered significantly from pandemic-induced border closures and lockdowns. It is certainly not the time to be levying additional costs on a sector that has not only seen many thousands of job losses, but been forced to make difficult decisions that have impacted on staff, students and research, but has absolutely been left out in the cold by this government, high and dry, when it comes to government support and assistance. Disturbingly, it was revealed during the most recent round of Senate estimates that the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency has not done or sought any modelling on the impacts of this shift that this shift will have on individual providers in the sector. And we are not talking about a small shift, Mr Acting Deputy President. This is not some sort of minor regulatory change that seeks to tinker around the edges. We know that, for example, for small and medium higher education providers, and remember these organisations have been significantly impacted and disrupted by both the lack of international students and the ever-receding horizon for a time frame for their return, and of course lockdowns. For these providers, increasing regulatory levies and fees by up to 700% represents a very real and present danger to their very existence. 700%. It's not a rounding error, in case you thought it was, Mr Acting Deputy President. It's a substantive and potentially devastating increase. A fee change, indeed increase, of this nature and its impact should have been modelled by the government or their agency in advance of seeking to bring about this change. The fact that this hasn't occurred is simply not good enough. Unfortunately, it is in no way surprising, because sadly we can add these bills to the seemingly endless list of examples of the Morrison government seeking to undermine and attack this nation's world-leading higher education providers. These are institutions who have been repeatedly crying out for assistance and supports for 18 months, and instead of offering a helping hand to bolster our nation's centres of knowledge, research and development, all we see from Mr Morrison and this government is kick after kick, right in their time of need, abandoned yet again by the Liberal Morrison government. In this time of need, you'd think maybe, just maybe, the Australian government would deliver support in the budget for our universities. But did the budget have any extra dollars for our universities? No. Actually, they got a cut. In fact, real funding for higher education will fall by a staggering 10% over the next 3 years. Just think about that. At a time when it couldn't be clearer that investing in higher education, research, development and building our nation's collective knowledge would provide the best pathway for success in this globalised and challenging world, this government, the Morrison Liberal government, seeks not to invest in the people and places that provide this essential service, but rather to attack and gut them. Astonishing, short-sighted, damaging to our nation's future and future potential. Not only that, but this year's budget papers have also confirmed that due to job-ready graduates, funding provided by the Australian government to universities will be lower and student debt will rise. Remember this at the same time as many tens of thousands of students across Australia face fee increases at the start of this semester, and not small increases. For some students, this hike amounted to a doubling in their course fee. And what about the current state of play for the sector as a whole? Well, what we've seen is that universities collectively are suffering a loss in revenue of some $3 billion. The impact this is having on our economy as a whole has been quantified somewhere in the order of $9 billion lost due to the collapse in international student revenue. Faced with this stark, cold, harsh reality, one might be forgiven for thinking our government would seek to help our universities, our researchers, our teachers and our students to ride through this rough time. Well, you might think that, but sadly, unbelievably, it is not the case, because instead, the Morrison Liberal government has sought not to help our universities, but to hinder them, to launch attack after attack, Mr. Acting Deputy President, cut after cut, dagger after dagger. Perhaps the most obvious example would be the fact that the government proactively changed JobKeeper rules on not one but 3 occasions in a very deliberate and targeted effort to guarantee that our Australian universities could not access much-needed support to retain critical jobs in the sector. Add to that, right in the middle of our Australian universities' hour of need, Scott Morrison's Liberal government has cut support meant to ensure this nation's world-leading research was kept alive. Now, Labor acknowledges that in the 2020 budget the government did provide an extremely modest support of $1 billion across the entire sector, meant to partly ally the impact of falling revenue from international students. However, this year the government decided to cut that funding, presumably on the basis that the pandemic was over and international students would return. Well, that hasn't happened, has it? Instead, thanks to the Prime Minister's botched vaccination rollout, we are no closer to knowing when our full international student cohort will be able to return. What is the direct result of all this? The deliberate attacking of this most pivotal of sectors right when it needs help the most? Well, the answer is more than 17,000 Australians have lost their job. And to really rub it in, the government thinks by prioritising these bills, Mr. Acting Deputy President, that now is the time to levy yet further fees and charges on our university and consequently on our students. Extraordinary. 17,000 jobs have already been thrown on the scrap heap. How many more will it take for the government to be satisfied that its cuts to our nation's knowledge capacity are enough? These jobs are academic jobs. They're tutors, teachers, lecturers and researchers. But the flow-on consequences are vast. We've seen administrative staff and the many other virtual support roles that keep universities going impact it too. These are all people with families and bills to pay. Yet these are people whose livelihoods and jobs our Prime Minister has proactively sought to throw on the scrap heap. If the Liberal Party, if this government really cared about protecting Australian jobs, we would be debating in this place right now a bill to support this sector and every single Australian who works in it. Not these bills designed to impose yet higher costs and rip more away from an already struggling yet essential component of this nation's economic fabric. What is it about our Australian universities and the people who work within them that Mr Morrison finds unworthy of providing the same sort of support and protection that has been afforded other workers? We've already seen that the budget provided no meaningful assistance for our Australian public universities. Not only that, what it did provide was for a real cut in funding of some 10%, over 10% in the coming years. On top of that, the emergency funding meant to keep researchers in work was axed despite the fact that this crisis is far from over. In fact, the impact of this crisis has been felt ever more harshly and for ever-increasing length of time due to this Prime Minister and this government's ineptitude when it comes to their failures on quarantine and the nation's vaccination rollout. Students, workers and the entire sector dread what will come next from this government. After 8 long years of attack, first from Mr Abbott, then from Mr Turnbull and now relentlessly from Mr Morrison, a government who thinks the ability to obtain a university degree should be dependent on your ability to pay. A Liberal government happy to consign Australian students to a lifetime of debt. Indeed, this year's budget papers have confirmed for the first time in writing, mind you, something the government has refused to admit in public. That is that this Morrison Liberal government is saving money by dramatically hiking fees on students, transferring responsibility for the nation's debt from the Commonwealth to our Australian students. The Australian people don't want this country to become like the US of A. They don't want Australian kids to be saddled with a lifetime of debt just to have the ability to get an education. And Labor certainly doesn't want that either. That's why we've been calling for support for the sector, to support jobs, staff, students and our amazing world-class Australian higher education institutions. That's why we oppose these bills and everyone like them as this government has sought to drive the knife into the Australian universities and students over 8 long years. Enough is enough. We are now at the point where we are talking about our kids graduating from university with debts of $60,000 just for a basic degree. This simply shouldn't be. How are young Australians supposed to save up a deposit for a home, let alone find a job and pay the bills with this lifetime of debt hanging over their heads? It's shameful and disgraceful that these bills will only make it worse, Mr Acting Deputy. Worse for students, worse for staff, worse for academics, worse for researchers. Further eroding and undermining one of Australia's greatest success stories. Our high-quality, world-leading Australian public universities and higher education providers. Something, Mr Acting Deputy President, something that we should be proud to support, we should be proud to encourage and we should grow, not attack. It is for these reasons that Labor does and will oppose these bills, and I urge the Senate to reject them. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President.